These eyes, I can't see a damn thing. Where the hell did everybody go? I can't even see my feet. Yeah, was that 6 shots or only 5?
There are movie stars. Then there are legends. And then, floating somewhere in a category entirely of his own, there is Clint Eastwood, the man whose squint alone has launched 1,000 imitations, whose voice sounds like gravel being poured through a saxophone, and whose mere presence on screen can make an entire audience hold its breath without saying a single word. He is, without question, the most imitated man in Hollywood history. And that is not an overstatement. Walk into any comedy club on any given weekend in any city in the world, and somewhere, someone is doing Clint Eastwood. They are narrowing their eyes. They are dropping their jaw just slightly. They are growling from somewhere deep in the throat, trying to channel that mythical, weathered voice that feels like it was forged in the dust of a Nevada desert back in 1964 and never quite cleaned up.
Why?
Why is Clint Eastwood the ultimate target? The answer, when you really think about it, is surprisingly elegant. Most celebrities are imitated because they're funny or strange or cartoonishly extreme. But Clint Eastwood? He gets imitated because he is the living embodiment of cool, and cool, as it turns out, is profoundly funny when done wrong, and somehow even funnier when done right. Today, we are going on a journey. We are going to look at some of the most insane, most inspired, most surprisingly emotional Clint Eastwood impressions ever caught on camera. We are going to talk about what makes them work, what makes some of them fail spectacularly, and what these impressions collectively reveal about one of the most fascinating figures in the history of American cinema. Buckle up, because we are about to go ahead and make your day. Before we get into the impressions themselves, let's talk about the raw material. What exactly are people imitating when they do Clint Eastwood? Clint Eastwood Jr. was born on May 31, 1930, and rose to international fame with his role as the man with no name in Sergio Leone's Dollars trilogy of spaghetti westerns during the mid-1960s, and later as anti-hero cop Harry Callahan in the 5 Dirty Harry films throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Those are the two pillars of the Eastwood voice mythology, the poncho-wearing gunslinger who barely spoke at all, and the snarling San Francisco detective who made silence feel like a threat. Here's the technical breakdown of what makes the voice so singular and so imitable. First, there's the rasp, a kind of controlled gravel that sits in the lower register of the vocal range. It's not a shout. It's barely even a full voice in the traditional sense. It's a whisper that somehow carries the weight of a freight train. Second, there's the compression. Eastwood delivers words slowly, deliberately, as if each syllable is a coin he is choosing whether or not to spend. Third, and this is the key that most impressionists miss, there's the stillness. Eastwood barely moves his jaw when he talks. The words come from somewhere deeper, somewhere internal, and the face remains almost completely neutral. Getting one of those 3 elements right is easy. Getting all 3 simultaneously, while also maintaining the posture, the squint, and the general aura of a man who has seen everything and is mildly unimpressed by all of it, that is the Everest of Impressionism. And yet, the greatest impressionists out there have made that climb look almost effortless. Let's start with the legend. Jim Carrey, the rubber-faced Canadian who has been doing impressions since he was a child in Newmarket, Ontario, studying faces in mirrors and performing for anyone who would watch him. At age 8, Carrey began making faces before a mirror and discovered a talent for doing impressions. At age 10, Carrey wrote a letter to Carol Burnett of The Carol Burnett Show pointing out that he was already a master of impressions and should be considered for a role on the show. From those early days, Carrey spent decades refining a toolkit of celebrity voices, and Clint Eastwood was one of his crown jewels. Here's what makes the Carrey Eastwood impression so remarkable. It isn't just a vocal trick. Carrey transforms his entire body. The jaw sets. The eyes narrow into that legendary squint. Something happens to his posture. It shifts into a kind of coiled stillness, like a man pretending to be relaxed but who is never, ever truly relaxed. Carrey captures not just how Eastwood sounds, but how Eastwood feels. Jim Carrey and Clint Eastwood appeared alongside each other in 1988's The Dead Pool, the 5th and final film in the Dirty Harry franchise. The most iconic impression Carrey gave of the hard-nosed actor came in 1996 when presenting him with the AFI Life Achievement Award. Think about the audacity of that moment, standing in front of Clint Eastwood, with Clint Eastwood watching from the front row, and doing Clint Eastwood directly to his face. The eyebrows Carrey does when satirizing Eastwood are comedy gold, as is the quip about loving the tape and showing it to all his friends. He turns Eastwood into a breathy, suggestive character, a brilliant deconstruction of his tough guy persona. What made the whole thing transcend mere imitation was Clint's response. Because Eastwood, famously impervious to almost everything, was laughing. And not politely, genuinely. That moment, if you have never seen it, tells you everything about both men. Carey's genius is that he found the warmth inside the granite. He didn't mock Eastwood. He celebrated him. If Jim Carrey is the modern master of the Eastwood impression, then Rich Little is its founding father. Rich Little is the man of 1,000 voices. Some of his favorite impressions are of stars Arnold Schwarzenegger, Sylvester Stallone, Jack Nicholson, and Clint Eastwood. He says, "They're easy to do. They are larger than life." Little adds, "An impression is what you think a person sounds like. It could be an exaggeration or a cartoon. It's your impression." That definition, what you think a person sounds like, is one of the most insightful things ever said about the art of impressionism, and it perfectly explains why Eastwood impressions work even when they are not phonetically accurate. Because what we think Eastwood sounds like is something specific and mythological. We think he sounds like the American West compressed into a larynx. We think he sounds like danger wrapped in patience. We think he sounds like the last man on earth who would ever say anything unnecessary. Little started his career at the age of 12 when he answered back to his teachers in their own voices. He says it took him 7 years to perfect Frank Sinatra, but only minutes to mimic some others. The implication, when you think about Eastwood, is that there are some voices so distinctive and so consistently performed across decades that they practically imitate themselves. Eastwood gave the world 50 years of the same essential character, deepened and refined but fundamentally unchanged. He handed impressionists a gift. They just had to pick it up. Rich Little's version of Dirty Harry, retooled, domesticated, applied to mundane situations, is comedy gold because it takes a character of mythic seriousness and deposits him in the ordinary world. The result is absurd and brilliant in equal measure. When that voice, asks about toilet flushing in the manner of a lethal confrontation, the comedy comes from the collision of registers. The most dangerous voice in cinema applied to the most mundane of domestic complaints. That's the genius move. And Rich Little understood it perfectly. Now here's a different category of Eastwood impression, one that comes not from a comedian, not from a professional impressionist, but from a collaborator. Tom Hanks worked with Clint Eastwood on Sully, the 2016 biographical film about pilot Chesley Sullenberger. Eastwood directed a number of highly successful films that were either nominated or won Academy Awards, including Sully, 2016, which received widespread praise for both Eastwood and its star, Tom Hanks. What Hanks captured in his talk show recollections wasn't the voice per se, it was the directing style. And what he described is something that no acting school in the world teaches, because it is completely unique to Clint Eastwood. Here's the thing about Eastwood as a director. Known on set as a director for filming very few takes, Tim Robbins once said that when working on Mystic River, Eastwood would usually ask for only 1 take, or 2 if you were lucky, and that a day of filming would consist of starting no earlier than 9 a.m. and you leave, usually, after lunch. When directing, he simply says, "Okay," instead of "action" and "cut." Think about what that means in practice. You are an actor. You have prepared for this role for months. You have researched, rehearsed, maybe physically transformed yourself. You walk onto the Clint Eastwood set expecting the kind of meticulous multi-take, let's try it 17 different ways process you would find on almost any other major Hollywood production. Instead, all right, go ahead. 1 take. Maybe 2. That's enough of that. On to the next scene. It's intimidating in a way that no amount of shouting could ever be. Because when Eastwood wraps a scene after 1 take, you don't know if you nailed it or if he just doesn't care. And that ambiguity, that perfect, terrifying ambiguity, is the essence of the man. Tom Hanks, to his enormous credit, captured that specific quality perfectly. The laconic efficiency. The total absence of the usual Hollywood reassurance machine. The sense that you are dealing with someone for whom most of what passes as necessary in film production is simply not. And then there is Bradley Cooper's impression, which is arguably the most charming and the most unexpected of the entire genre. American Sniper is a 2014 biographical war drama film directed and co-produced by Clint Eastwood. It stars Bradley Cooper as Kyle. Cooper spent enormous time on set with Eastwood, enough time to absorb the full texture of the man, not just the public persona but the private quirks. And the quirk he chose to share with Jimmy Fallon on The Tonight Show is remarkable. Apparently, on the Warner Brothers lot, Clint Eastwood had a habit of feeding the squirrels. Every morning. The man whose on-screen persona is so uncompromisingly tough that his mere squint can end a conversation, that man would stop whatever he was doing, crouch down slightly, and coax small woodland creatures to come eat from his hand. What makes Cooper's impression so brilliant is the seamless transition he performs between Eastwood's intimidating directorial presence and this unexpectedly tender daily ritual. The same low, gravelly, barely above a whisper voice that has barked orders on set is suddenly deployed in service of gentle encouragement toward a squirrel. "Come on, you little guys. There you go. Get in there. That's it. All right." It's the combination that makes it hilarious and somehow deeply endearing. Because it reveals something true about Clint Eastwood that all the biographies and the cinematic analyses somehow miss. Beneath the granite, there is warmth. The man who spent decades playing characters who did not need anybody has, in real life, a soft spot for small animals who trust him enough to eat from his hand. Cooper, by capturing that contradiction, did something more than a great impression. He painted a portrait. Now let's talk about the most genetically unique entry in this entire canon. Scott Eastwood doing Clint Eastwood. His known children include Scott Eastwood, born in 1986. And Scott, by all accounts, grew up not being shouted at by his father. He grew up being looked at, studied, measured. The full weight of the Eastwood stare deployed on an unsuspecting child who had done something questionable and now had to reckon with the silent, nuclear-grade disapproval of one of cinema's greatest communicators of nonverbal intensity. When Scott does his impression of his dad, what he is actually doing is something far more intimate than any professional impressionist could achieve. He is doing an impression of a parent. He is recreating the specific experience of being the person Clint Eastwood looked at, really looked at, when you had tested the limits of his patience. The head tilt. The slight narrowing of eyes that are already narrow. The "oh yeah, really?" delivered in a tone that implies the questioner already knows the answer and is simply giving you the opportunity to reconsider your position before things become more serious. Scott Eastwood has had that look directed at him his entire life, and when he recreates it, you can feel the authenticity radiating off every syllable. There is also something poignant about watching a son imitate his father. Scott doesn't just capture the voice. He captures the posture, the economy of movement, the fundamental stillness that makes Clint Eastwood so unsettling in the best possible way. It's the impression that comes from the most intimate knowledge, decades of proximity to the original. Let's step back for a moment and ask the bigger question. Why is Clint Eastwood so imitable? What is the formula? The answer lies in something voice experts and phoneticians call vocal signature, the constellation of qualities that make a voice immediately recognizable. Most people's voices are the product of their vocal anatomy, their regional accent, their habitual speaking rhythms, and their emotional register. Clint Eastwood has all of those things in extremis. The rasp is real, it's not an affectation, it's how he sounds. But Eastwood has also, across 60-plus years of public life, leaned into and refined certain qualities. The slowness, the minimalism, the sense that every word is chosen with the care of a man who knows that silence is also an option, and often a better one. He has essentially built a brand around a specific vocal identity, and that brand is so consistent, so recognizable, and so antithetical to the way most people actually talk that it becomes perfect fodder for impressionism. There's also the cultural weight. When someone does Clint Eastwood, they are not just imitating a voice, they are invoking an entire mythology. The faint hint of humanity that Eastwood shows in the good, the bad, and the ugly was enough to garner the audience's sympathy and finally make him an international movie star. The man with no name. Dirty Harry. Every Eastwood character who ever stared down an antagonist with complete, devastating calm while the rest of the world held its breath. That mythology is portable. It can be applied to any situation. Ordering coffee, feeding squirrels, giving notes on a scene, and the collision of that mythic register with mundane reality is where the comedy lives. Here is the thing that strikes you when you watch enough Clint Eastwood impressions. Despite the infinite variety of approaches, the professional voice actor, the A-list movie star, the comedian, the son, they all arrive at more or less the same place. Quietly dangerous. Economical to the point of poetry. somehow managing to communicate more through what is left unsaid than what is spoken aloud. That consensus is remarkable. It means that Eastwood has created something truly rare, a persona so coherent, so completely realized, so absolutely consistent across decades of work that it registers identically in the nervous systems of people who have never met him, people who worked with him for months, and people who grew up with him at the breakfast table. From boyish, lovable, and highly principled, Eastwood transformed into tough, grizzled, and morally ambiguous, from television juvenile to international movie icon. That transformation happened in the span of a single role, The Man with No Name, and Eastwood spent the next 60 years building on that foundation without ever losing sight of what made it work. The Impressionists understand this. The best ones aren't just copying a sound. They are reverse engineering a philosophy. The philosophy of the man who does not need to raise his voice because his presence alone is already the loudest thing in the room. So what separates a great Eastwood impression from a merely competent one? The voice is the obvious starting point. You need the rasp, the compression, the slow delivery. But the voice alone, as countless karaoke-level impressionists have discovered to their disappointment, is not enough. It sounds like someone gargling gravel without the accompanying stillness. Because Eastwood's voice doesn't exist in isolation, it exists in the context of a body that almost never moves unnecessarily, a face that reveals almost nothing, and a pair of eyes that seem permanently calibrated to a middle distance somewhere between focused on you and thinking about something more important. The jaw must be set. Not clenched, set. There's a difference. Clenched is tension. Set is resolve. The head should tilt very slightly, as if the person being regarded is a puzzle that is almost, but not quite, interesting enough to be worth solving. The arms should hang loose, because the Eastwood hands are not expressive tools. They are potential weapons kept in reserve. And then, this is the part that separates the elite impressionists from everyone else. The pace. Every sentence must breathe. Every pause is intentional. The silence between words isn't dead air. It's the sound of a man choosing whether or not to continue. Get all of that right simultaneously, and you have something that makes a room stop. Something that makes people laugh because recognition is funny, because the gap between myth and reality is funny, and because Clint Eastwood is, somehow, both the most intimidating and the most inherently comedic figure that American cinema has ever produced. No discussion of Eastwood impressions would be complete without acknowledging the single moment that gave